Okay, this last video focuses on the two probably most overlooked or overutilized or underutilized. They are very much the controversial damage modifiers, and that's because I feel like some people kind of give average damage a bad rap, at the same time as giving attack speed a better rep than it deserves. So, first, I'm going to start off by saying your sheet DPS is a function of all of these numbers. Now, attacks per second, what Diablo does is says, oh, okay, you have 2.33 attacks per second, so you must hit with your weapon 2.3 times per second, so you should be doing 2.3 times the damage you would be doing if you had one attack per second. So basically it takes your DPS and says, alright, multiplying that by 2.33, and that's how much damage you're doing. But in reality, that's not really how it works, because you have downtime. If you run out of hatred like me, you might have a cooldown build and you have a few seconds of downtime there. Whatever the case, you know that you're not actually hitting as hard as your damage would have you think, because your damage is just a rough estimate of how much damage you could do based on the gear you have. So that's kind of why attack speed is a little misleading as a damage modifier. And average damage is not misleading, it's just people don't like to look at average damage and do the math, even though the game does most of it for you. I have a friend that rolled off average damage over dexterity on a monk or a demon hunter item, I don't remember which one. Either way, he has approximately the same gear as me. Not the same, but little less dexterity, a little less everything, but for the most part, the same. Now, he saw that dexterity and said, oh, it's got 400 dex, that's a 4% damage increase, and there's no flaw in that argument. If he has around 10,000 dex, 400 dex is, yeah, probably a 4% damage increase. The flaw in the argument is kind of where he says that, oh, average damage, I only had 80 average damage because it was between this number and this number. It's not really that good. But what people don't take into account is the fact that your weapon works off of average damage, so that pretty much has to mean that average damage is affected by every single thing your weapon damage is affected by. So Diablo takes your weapon, and I'm guessing takes the average damage of the weapon, and then that's how it gets the base number to take all these things and multiply it by. What people don't realize is that average damage is multiplied in effect by all of these things. So I have, let's say, that top number, 135 top damage. So what it does is it says, okay, actually what it probably does is it says 64 to 135, divides that by 2 for the average, but let's say for the sake of argument it does it backwards. It says, okay, that 135 is actually 135 times 10,874% times 2.3 attacks per second times critical hit chance times critical hit damage, and then you take that, and if you want your realistic, you're against elites and whatnot, you take that times 1.41 times 1.71 or whatever you have. So don't discount average damage just because it seems like 130 damage isn't that much, when in reality, if your weapon damage was mine's 1352 to 1614, if that added 100 damage, that DPS would go by a couple hundred, and a couple hundred DPS difference in your damage is a lot of damage. So with that all being said, what I'm going to really say about average damage and attack speed is be careful of which one you pick. If you're using a one-hander or a two-hander, attack speed is extremely misleading. So I gain a lot of damage from having 7% attack speed on my gloves. Or if not a lot, but I gain some damage. Basically, it's taking my damage multiplied by 2.33. If I took my gloves off, it multiplies it by 2.21. Of course, I don't have anything to kind of prove this. I don't have 50% damage, 10% crit chance gloves, but I have something close, maybe. Let me check my stash. Alright, I lose 6.5% damage from this change. That's only 42 dex, so that's about 0.4%. So let's say 6% I lose. Now, there's no way 2% crit damage and 0.5% crit chance is 6%. It's coming from that attack speed. But in reality, when I take this off, I fire at 2.21. You probably can't even notice a difference. When I put it on, I fire at about the same speed. So your damage kind of doesn't really take that into account. Like, realistically, I probably still do the same damage I did. It's just my average damage has gone down because the game says, oh, you can't attack as fast, obviously you're not doing as much damage. So, using a one-hander, rule of thumb, when you get to a certain point and you're happy with your attacks per second, average damage is probably generally better than attack speed. And while I'm talking about better than attack speed, keep in mind your dexterity could also, or strength or intellect, could also be better than average damage or attack speed. But usually it's the other things that if you had a chance between critical hit chance or damage, you pretty much always take those over attack speed or average damage. But when you're battling with that last couple of, like, oh, I have this choice between 100 average damage and 5% attack speed, keep in mind that, those are two things that are, on their own, average damage is misleading, but attack speed is to a point. If you need to attack faster, you might want to pick that. Your average damage will probably look better than, or at least it could look better than the average damage from the ring or whatever that you're like sacrificing that has the average damage. But keep in mind that when you have enough attacks per second, you have a diminishing return quality on your attacks per second when you have increase in attack speed, and that actually makes average damage, even sheet-wise, a little better than attack speed if you have a fast weapon. Now, if you have a slow weapon, you might want attack speed, but usually people call it kind of the icing on the cake. You don't need attack speed with a slow weapon. That's pretty much counterintuitive. I can understand with Demon Hunter wanting some attack speed, because I'd like to get my attacks out there and regenerate hatred. But to that effect, when I'm a monk, or when I'm a barbarian and I'm using the furnace, I want to just charge shit. Like, I don't need attack speed. When I'm on a witch doctor, it's probably going to take you longer to pick a different target for your haunt than it is to cast it, or than it is to like cast it twice with attack speed. You're using a furnace on almost any character, and you can almost guarantee that attack speed is okay, but not really important. So, that being said, the takeaway from here is, on the hierarchy, I would always take elemental damage over crit damage, which I would take over crit chance, which I would usually take over attack. I would always take over attack speed or average damage for those. And then average damage and attack speed kind of fall on the same spectrum. Like, those are kind of the two things you come down to and say, I'm going to compare this with dex or whatever my baseline percent damage is, and I'm going to eliminate, whether I want dex or attack speed based on what that tells me, assuming you're going straight for damage or, whatever else it might be. But then you look at average damage and attack speed and you're like, well, the attack speed says I gain 4% damage, whereas average damage says I gain 5%. But if you know that the attacks per second won't actually help you, the average damage is almost always better. And to that effect, so is the dexterity. So, just be cognizant. If you don't need attack speed, go for average damage or dex. And out of those two, go for the one, either you want 2% toughness and 2% damage, or maybe you want like just 3 or 4% flat damage. Either way, you want to go for one of those two. Now, if the attack speed actually helps you a lot, like if you're spamming like a motherfucker, you might want that attack speed over average damage, even though average damage adds more. And keep in mind, if you don't have much attack speed and you're looking at average damage, that attack speed being added to your character could be heavily inflated, just because your character is just now getting some attack speed, and all of a sudden the game's like, holy shit, he just gained 7% damage from that 7% attack speed, when in reality, no, I can attack 7% faster than I used to be able to, which doesn't actually help me that much. So hopefully you guys learned something from this like little video series. Again, if you have any other questions or things I can clarify or help on, or if I'm totally off on something you want to talk to me about it, just let me know in the comments. I'll be more than happy to talk with you, and peace out.